Member for Niagara Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, today I'm pleased to rise in the House and recognize small businesses across Canada during Small Business Week. Small businesses continue to be the backbone of our economy, in turn, the backbone of our communities. From coast to coast to coast, hardworking entrepreneurs provide jobs to our communities, innovation to our economy, incubating the next generation of inspiration. Back in 1922, my great-grandparents started a mom-and-pop grocery store in my home riding of Niagara Centre. 4 generations later, I had the pleasure of operating that same business, which had since evolved into a ship chandler wholesaler. I know firsthand the daily struggles and complexities our small business owners face, and our government is focused on enabling them to thrive. Because when our small businesses thrive, our communities thrive. It's all about building communities. So this week, Mr. Speaker, let's celebrate the small businesses across this country and the communities they continue to strengthen. Thank you, and happy Small Business Week.
The Honourable Member for Red Deer, Mountain View.
The gift of life is so precious. Canadian Blood Services' motto is, "It's in you to give." And there is no one that has lived that mantra more than Penhold's Josephine Michalak, who was just recognized by the Guinness World Records as the female with the most whole blood donated. Josephine earned the record after donating her 203rd unit of blood in December of last year. Josephine's epic journey started back in 1965 while accompanying her sister, who was on her way to donate. The experience left a great impression with Josephine. And with her O positive blood type, she realized just how important her highly compatible blood type was to the people in her community. Penhold's Town Council acknowledged her record at its October 11th meeting, and I quote, "for reaching this milestone and for her selfless act to help others," end quote. Her 208th donation will be on November 24th. Congratulations, Josephine.
Bravo.
The Honourable Member for Fredericton.
Mr. Speaker, I have the privilege to stand in this House and to use my voice to shine a light or reflect on a moment in time on behalf of my constituents. I know that over the last weeks our hearts and souls have been mourning, as we are witnessing violence and endless suffering generated by war. I send my love and support to the Muslim and Jewish community here and abroad who are directly impacted by the events that are unfolding. Words might appear insignificant at a time when we are collectively facing horror. Words can hurt, but they can also heal. They can change how we perceive the words. We need to see the humanity in one another and not lose sight of everything we have in common. We need to reflect on how we can work and listen to each other. Our own country is on a path of reconciliation. Getting there was not easy and is still a constant reaffirmation of our commitment to a better future for all. That is the message I humbly share today. Peace cannot be achieved through violence. It can only be attained through understanding. I pray for the world. I pray for peace, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Courtenay Alberni.
Mr. Speaker, on the eve of the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation this year, I was honoured to join a celebration in Newfoundland Territory of the art created by attendees of the former Alberni Indian Residential School in the late 50s and 60s. This artwork was inspired by volunteer artist Robert Aller, who encouraged the young artists to paint their ideas, their knowledge, and their truths. After Robert passed away in 2008, 36 paintings were donated to the University of Victoria and then repatriated to the survivors, who created them and to their families in 2013. With the assistance of Professor Andrea Walsh in partnership with one of the artists, Wally Samuel from Ahousaht. Since then, they have been widely exhibited to educate Canadians and the world about the legacy of residential schools. They have reached thousands of learners through gallery exhibitions, digital platforms, and public presentations. Canadians owe these artists and their families an enormous debt of gratitude for the generosity of spirit, sharing these wonderful paintings as we seek to reconcile historical wrongs with Indigenous people. Clecco to all.
The Honourable Member for Argenteuil-La Petite Nation. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today, I rise to congratulate and celebrate Sylvie Ferrand-Gosselin, the first woman president of the Club Quad Petite Nation and a pioneer in the Ottawa region. From her years as a volunteer trail agent and head of part of the Duhamel sector, her Her dedication to the club is undeniable. I'd also like to acknowledge the encouragement of former President Alain Lamarche, who encouraged women to join the club's senior management team. Gender diversity in sports clubs enriches our communities, offering a variety of experiences and ideas. But despite the progress made, we still have a long way to go to achieve gender equality. That's why I call on all parliamentarians to continue supporting our government's efforts to improve equality of opportunity in Canada. We must continue to implement concrete actions that pave the way for women like Sylvie Ferrand-Gosselin in management positions at all levels. In conclusion, Mr. Speaker, congratulations to Club Quad Petite Nation. The Honourable Member for Montmagny, Liselec, Kamouraska, Rivière-du-Loup. Mr. Speaker, it is with great pride that I take the floor today to celebrate the 100th anniversary of Premier Tech, 100 years of history, determination, and daring, during which Premier Tech has forged a reputation for excellence. Its story began modestly with a small business that the Bélanger family bought. They then moved into horticulture with sphagnum peat moss, and today they are in automation and wastewater treatment. Premier Tech employs 5,200 people in 28 countries, has 48 plants, and generates sales of over $1 billion. Committed to its home community, Premier Tech is also involved internationally in the world of cycling. The Premier Tech Israel team has achieved major success in the Tour de France with Canadian riders. I would like to acknowledge my friends Bernard Bélanger and his son Jean, whose hard work and vision have shaped our community and made a positive impact worldwide. I wish Premier Tech a bright and prosperous future. Happy 100th to all of Premier Tech's teammates. The Honourable Member for Humber River, Black Creek.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Last week, the Canadian Council of Imams hosted its annual gala dinner. Founded in 1990, the Council has been a unifying forum for Canadian imams and chaplains. At this 5th annual gala dinner, a member of my constituency, Chaplain Imam Imran Ali, received the well-deserved Community Imam Award in recognition of his continuing service to society. Imran's dedication is truly inspiring, and his recognition by his peers speaks volumes about the impact he has had on our community. Through his tireless efforts, he has not only served the Muslim community, but also made significant contributions to society. We are fortunate to have individuals like Imran among us, individuals who work tirelessly to bridge divides, to bring communities together, and to spread the message of love, compassion, and unity. My sincere congratulations to Imran. May peace and unity continue to guide our path forward. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
If I could just remind members, please, to keep their voices down while the members are making their statements. The Honourable Member from Sackville, Preston, Chesapeake.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. A new report from the Public Policy Forum concludes that Atlantic Canada's offshore wind potential will make the region an energy powerhouse going forward. Installing turbines around Sable Island Bank alone could produce enough energy supply for 6.5 million average Canadian homes, which is almost twice as much as being used by Atlantic Canada today as we speak. This boom means that thousands of jobs and billions of dollars for Atlantic Canada. Yet on Tuesday, the Conservatives, including several MPs from Atlantic Canada, voted against Bill C-49, a bill that would allow the development of offshore wind industry in Nova Scotia, Newfoundland, and Labrador. On this side of the House, Mr. Speaker, you can count on our government to help Atlantic Canadians today and every day.
The Honourable Member for North Okanagan, Shuswap.
Mr. Speaker, the NDP Liberal government knew the carbon tax too would increase the cost of energy and disproportionately impact low and middle income Canadians, and yet they're imposing it anyway. Carbon taxes 1 and 2 will add 61 cents per litre to the price of fuel. Because of this government's punishing fuel taxes, we're already seeing fuel prices in BC over $2 per litre. Wow. After 8 long years of inflationary spending and failing policies, even the Liberal MPs are speaking out against the carbon tax. Those Liberal MPs are realizing that when you tax Brad, the farmer who grows the food, and Rob, who transports the food, and tax Joanne, who has to drive to buy the food becomes too expensive. It's no wonder 60% more Canadians per month were expected to use food banks in 2023. Mr. Speaker, after 8 years, it is even more clear that this Prime Minister is not worth the cost.
Hear, hear, hear.
The Honourable Member for Winnipeg North.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to give a special acknowledgement and shout out to the Winnipeg transit drivers for both educating me and being there in a very real and tangible way to ensure that there's all forms of diversity in transportation. You know, over the summer, the Government of Canada tabled a report about public transit in general in Canada. No government in the history of Canada has committed more public dollars to ensure that we have a solid public transit system from coast to coast, Mr. Speaker. A commitment that is genuine. It's there to help build communities and connect people in every way. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Hear, hear.
Then I have
The Honourable Member for Langley Aldergrove.
After 8 years of this NDP Liberal government, where are we at? Well, more Canadians frozen out of the housing market, rents doubling, inflationary deficits driving up mortgage payments, and our federal government saying, hey, our inflation isn't all that bad. Look at other countries, which is exactly what an enterprising Ontario couple did. They sold their modest 2,400 square foot suburban home in Fergus and bought a 6,300 square foot chateau in the south of France on 37 acres. It was an even trade. But with this NDP Liberal Made in Canada inflation, they said if we sold the chateau now, we probably couldn't move back to Fergus. Mr. Speaker, more and more Canadians are realizing that this tax and spend Liberal Prime Minister is just not worth the cost, at least not for those ordinary Canadians who are hoping one day to have their own modest home right here at home in Canada. Thank you.
Then I have
The Honourable Member for Desnethé, Mississippi, Churchill River.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, after 8 years of this Liberal NDP government, life is unaffordable. Families in northern Saskatchewan and across Canada are faced every day with austerity measures. Less food, less activities for their kids, less trips to see Grandma and Grandpa, less money for rent or a mortgage at the end of every month. Yet, as families are forced to make cuts, this Liberal NDP government spends. Mr. Speaker, there's something morally wrong when a government grows bigger and continuously throws money around while taxpayers themselves are forced into cutting for their own families. This is backwards. The solution is less for the government and more in the pockets of families, more healthy food, more activities for their kids, more trips and time to spend with family. Mr. Speaker, the Liberal NDP government's inflationary deficits are driving up the cost of everything, and Canadians are tired of it, and they want hope. After 8 long years, this Prime Minister is simply not worth the cost.
Hear, hear.
Then I have
The Honourable Member for Longueuil-Charles-Le-Moyne. Tonight, thousands of Quebecers in over 40 cities across Quebec will take part in Nuit des Sans-Abris, an event designed to raise public awareness of poverty and homelessness in Quebec. This year, Longueuil's Nuit des Sans-Abris marks its 25th year. A number of activities are planned to give people a better understanding of the difficult conditions in which people experiencing homelessness live, and to learn more about the organizations that work with them. Residents are invited to Parc Saint-Marc tonight to visit the community village, listen to stories from people who have experienced homelessness, and take part in the Solidarity Walk. I congratulate the Table Itinérance Rive-Sud and all the members of the organizing committee for their commitment to giving a voice to those who are homeless and to demystifying the reality of homelessness. Thank you.
Then I have
The Honourable Member for Windsor West.
Mr. Speaker, normally I rise in this chamber with gratitude and vigor, but today, as the events of the last 2 weeks in this attacks by Hamas and response by Israel has me at a loss. I represent a riding with a Jewish population that has contributed so much, including fighting in both world wars. From my work, I know the constant battle of anti-Semitism that we face and the symbols of hate that have been painted on the sidewalks, streets, and even my own lawn signs. I'm blessed in the Windsor-Detroit area of having a Middle East population, and I have stood in solidarity from the original blame of the Oklahoma City bombing to 9/11 blame and Islamophobia that still persists, and I'm proud to be part of a movement to always push back and speak the truth against that type of rhetoric. My statement today was crafted many times to try and help end the violence in Gaza, Israel, and Lebanon, but despite trying, it never left me feeling ill. So here I am, and my only message is to find enough forgiveness and respect and humanity to end all violence. I appreciate it's a naive one, but after 21 plus years in Parliament, I need to speak the truth, and the truth is that I don't have the answers, but I love my constituents of all race, ethnicity, and religion, and I'm sorry I don't have the solutions. I do know it's never too late to save who is alive. Please join me, or let me join you in solidarity for forgiveness of our failures to all the victims.
The Honourable Member for Longueuil-Saint-Hubert. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today is the 34th night of Nuit des Sans-Abri. This is an event to raise public awareness of homelessness and poverty, and it will be held in over 60 municipalities in Quebec. There are tents all over Quebec. There are single mothers who are sleeping in their cars with their children, seniors who, after having lived in housing and worked, are now on the street, young women who are pregnant and are homeless, and one who delivered on the street in Gatineau. Organizations are accompanying women who are in dangerous relationships because they don't have other housing. People have to limit their purchases of food and medication to get housing. Quebec is on the verge of a major humanitarian crisis. The government has already recognized that housing is a right. It needs to ensure that that right becomes a reality for all. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Honourable Member for Carleton.
Outbreak of the Israel-Hamas war. The Toronto Police Chief has reported a 132% increase in hate crimes. We see horrific stories of signs being written in spray paint in the Centennial Park that say, "Attack the Jews." Or in London, a vandalized message said, quote, "Kill all Muslims." This is absolutely unacceptable. We can all be revolted by the horrors of Hamas, but we should never blame our fellow citizens who are Muslim in Canada. They did not commit those atrocities. You can debate the decisions of the Israeli government, but you have no right to insult your Jewish neighbor or attack his local synagogue. This must be a country based on freedom where it doesn't matter if your name is Mohammed or Martin, Chang or Charles, Singh, Smith, or Steinberg. We are all Canadians. We are all compatriots. Let us embrace each other with love. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Kingston and the Islands.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I rise today excited to congratulate Umicore Rechargeable Battery Materials Canada. This past Monday marked their official groundbreaking for the manufacturing plant they're building in Loyalist Township, located just outside my riding. The plant will manufacture materials that are required for the production of electric vehicle batteries. In full swing, their operation has the capacity to produce enough battery materials to support the production of over 800,000 electric vehicles each year. What's more, this plant is designed to be nearly carbon neutral from the start of production. Of course, this is excellent news for our region in terms of economic development and job creation. It is also great news for Ontario and Canada as it helps strengthen our position as a global leader in electric vehicle and battery supply chain. I am proud that the federal government has committed up to $551 million through the Strategic Investment Fund to support this project. Congratulations and best wishes to Umicore, and thank you for choosing Eastern Ontario.
Right on.
Questions orales. L'honorable chef de l'opposition.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
After 8 years, this Prime Minister is not worth the cost. or the lack of competition. Yesterday, the Competition Bureau reported that now the lack of competition is worse than at any time in 20 years, leading to higher prices for consumers and higher profits for corporate oligarchs. Now the Liberal government is considering allowing Canada's biggest bank, gobble up the 7th biggest bank, to eliminate competition and force up mortgage rates on Canadians who already can't afford to pay their bills. Will the government side with consumers and home buyers instead of corporate oligarchs and big banks and block this merger?
The
Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, as the Conservative leader recycles common sense cliches from decades ago, like an automaton from the Mike Harris era, our government has taken decisive action to help Canadians with the price of groceries by supporting more competition in the marketplace and by increasing housing supply by waiving GST on new rental construction. These are two significant measures the members opposite can support right now by supporting the government's bill on affordability. But they've stated that they won't support that. Can someone from the opposition benches please explain to all of us how voting against measures that are going to substantially help middle-class families, how is that common sense?
L'honorable chef de l'opposition.
I'll tell you, not common sense. Spending $8 million on a barn, Mr. Speaker. We just found out that the Prime Minister's Capital Commission spent $8 million to replace a barn at Rideau Hall. We've long said that this Prime Minister is not worth the cost after 8 long years. While Canadians cannot afford a home, how is it that this Prime Minister is spending $8 million on a barn? And by the way, was it made of gold?
L'honorable secrétaire parlementaire.
Quite the words from the Leader of the Opposition. I remind him when he was responsible for housing during the Harper years, $300 million spent for housing, less than 100 homes built. Do the math, Mr. Speaker. $3 million a home. That's the record of so-called fiscal responsibility on the other side. On this side, we are getting homes built. Just this morning, the Prime Minister announced over $100 million for the city of Brampton that's going to lead to, in the coming years, 24,000 homes being built. Wow. We're going to continue to work with municipalities, Mr. Speaker, through partnership.
Here, here. Good job.
I would encourage all members, including the members who ask questions, to please listen to the responses, and then when they have the opportunity to take the floor again to pose their questions. The
Honourable Member for Mégantic-Larry. After 8 years with this Prime Minister, he's not worth the cost. So much money's been wasted. McKinsey consultations, ArriveCan, $6,000 a night for a hotel room. Today we found out that the government wasted $8 million for what? For a barn. How can you spend $8 million on a barn? On whose land? The Governor General's. Food banks are lacking resources. Is this the Liberals' priorities? Spend $8 million on a barn on the Governor General's property? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Obviously, we've been there for Canadians. We've invested to support them several times. And the Conservatives voted against those measures. But when the Conservatives were in power, 7 consecutive budgets led to deficits. We have the lowest deficit of all G7 countries right now. And we will continue to be financially responsible. The Honourable Member for Mégantic-Larry. Financially responsible. After 8 years of Liberal expenditures leading to inflation, inflation in Quebec is the highest in the country. People have to permanently live with their parents because everything costs too much. Interest rates are so high that Liberals have stolen the dream of young people to become homeowners. For 2 years, mortgages went up by 40%. After 8 years with the Liberals, the cost of rent has doubled. When will the Liberals stop mortgaging the future of young people and allow them to achieve their own dream of becoming a homeowner? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Monsieur le Président, nous avons justement un projet.
Mr. Speaker, we have a bill before us right now which will accelerate the construction of housing throughout Canada. In my riding in Montreal, co-ops are being built for families, our seniors, and our youth. The Conservatives don't want to invest to build more housing, to reduce costs for all Canadians. It doesn't make any sense. If they really have the interests of Canadians at heart, why are they voting against their interests? The Honourable Member for Méconseil-Clairac. Mr. Speaker, if they really wanted to pass Bill C-56, it's been since October 5th that the Liberals haven't called the bill in the House. We need a reason. We need to understand what they want. In the meantime, the middle class know what's going on. They're lining up at food banks. In the newspapers this morning, food banks are struggling. The cost of food has gone up by 23%. Mr. Speaker, the Liberals and the Bloc want to radically increase the carbon tax. It's expensive to vote for the Bloc and the Liberals. Will the Liberals finally decide to cut their costly tax? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
I recognize that the rising cost does hurt Canadians, and that's why we look across the way and we would like to see the Conservative Party stop playing the games. The destructive force that they are constantly playing inside the House, the holding up of legislation, whether it's dealing with providing rebates of one form or another, whether it's building the Atlantic Accord for Atlantic Canada, whether it's talking about green jobs into the future, we're trying to address the needs of Canadians, and the Conservative Party continues to play games inside the chamber. Shame on them.
L'honorable député de Saint-Jean.
The Honourable Member for Saint-Jean. Mr. Speaker, it looks like humanitarian aid will be able to get into Gaza today, but we already know that it will be insufficient. Only 20 trucks will be able to get through when really a minimum of 100 is needed every day, according to the UN. As we speak, tons of humanitarian aid are blocked on the tarmac of an Egyptian airport because they can't get through. Will the Prime Minister insist, or did the Prime Minister insist over the last 24 hours for this to be resolved? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary. Decisions made by Israel and Egypt to allow humanitarian aid into Gaza through Rafah is an important step to guarantee assistance to civilians in Gaza. However, there's a lot to be done. Unobstructed and quick access is essential to meet the needs of Palestinian citizens in Gaza. International law must be respected, always. The Honourable Member for Saint-Jean. We all hope for light at the end of the tunnel in this terrible war, but there are dark hours ahead of us. Calls from many countries to flee Lebanon say a lot. Everybody's expecting for the conflict to get worse. As the humanitarian crisis worsens, humanitarian aid is already not enough. Canada cannot maintain the status quo. It has to use its political weight. What will the government do right now to make sure that humanitarian aid gets through? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
L'allègement de souffrance humaine.
Relieving human suffering is our absolute priority. We were the first Western country to provide humanitarian aid. We're using every diplomatic channel and are in constant communication with our partners and organizations on the ground. Our immediate goal is to open humanitarian corridors, offer safety and shelter to those fleeing the war, and allow aid to get through. The Honourable Member for Vancouver East.
The auditor issued a damning report about processing delays in immigration. The most vulnerable are made to wait the longest due to Liberal mismanagement. Offices in sub-Saharan Africa are chronically underfunded, and they have the highest volume. Applications are untouched for up to 20 months. The average wait time for refugees is now 3 years. People who are being persecuted don't have 3 years to wait. Will the minister take immediate action to process the unacceptable backlogs for refugees?
Hear, hear.
L'honorable secrétaire parlementaire.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
You know, it's a great concern. We all want to see immigration processes speed up, and what you'll see is that over the last number of years, we have seen processing times improved in many different areas. Mr. Speaker, whether it is dealing with the sponsoring of parents, for example, sponsoring of spouses, we have seen dramatic increases. There are areas in which we do need to improve upon, and I can assure the member that we are in fact making progress in all the different areas as much as possible.
L'honorable député de Ladysmith, Nanaimo Ladysmith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. 1 in 4 Nanaimo renters are in core housing need, meaning that where they live is either unaffordable, unsuitable, or inadequate. And these are people who have housing. Too many do not. Nanaimo has a housing problem larger than its size, and we're seeing the symptoms of this all around us. People deserve better than years of liberal and conservative half measures. People deserve a place to call home. So why is it that the government is doubling down on their failed housing plan?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
I thank that member and the NDP caucus for supporting this government to double funding in response to homelessness. We continue to work with municipalities across the country. We continue to work with not-for-profit organizations. And it was this government that recognized, of course, Mr. Speaker, that there is a human right to housing. In that vein, we're seeing results, and there's more to do, but 70,000 people who were on the street are no longer on the street. 122,000 people who were close to homeless are not in that position anymore because of the National Housing Strategy. Thank you very much.
Hear, hear. L'honorable député de Paris Sound, Muskoka.
After 8 years of this NDP Liberal government, all Canadians now know that the Prime Minister is just simply not worth the cost. In 2021, a couple from Fergus, Ontario, swapped their 4-bedroom, 2,400-square-foot home on 3/4 of an acre for a 6,300-square-foot, 16th-century French chateau on 37 acres near the Bordeaux wine region in the south of France. Today, they admit that if they were to sell that mansion in the south of France, they wouldn't have enough money to buy their old home in Fergus. So I'm wondering why it is cheaper to buy a mansion in the south of France than a family home in rural Ontario.
L'honorable député de...
The Honourable Member, or rather the Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
He is a former mayor, and he knows, therefore, that the affordability challenge that Canadians face, whether it's respect to rent or whether it's respect to the challenge of buying a home, is due to a lack of supply. This government recognizes that. That's why we've moved ahead to put incentives on the table for the private sector, for example, for builders, lifting the GST on the construction of purpose-built rentals, period. That side wants to maintain the tax for the purposes of building rental homes for the middle class. It's unacceptable. It's a reckless approach, Mr. Speaker.
Hear, hear. L'honorable député de Paris Sound, Muskoka.
Well, I think the government, maybe this is the point. Canada has 20 times the land and half the people of France, and it's still cheaper to buy a house in France. But, of course, after 8 years of this Prime Minister's inflationary deficits, mortgage costs have doubled. In 2015, the average mortgage payment was $1,400, Mr. Speaker. Today, it's over $3,500. And now half of Canada's housing markets are severely unaffordable. When will the NDP Liberal coalition finally end their inflationary deficits so Canadians can afford to keep their homes, Mr. Speaker?
L'honorable secrétaire parlementaire.
Mr. Speaker, as I've said, and I emphasize, that the challenge on affordability with respect to housing, writ large, has to do with the lack of supply. When demand is high and supply is limited, you're always going to have an expensive situation. We see that with respect to housing. What this government is doing is working with municipalities to see more homes built. This morning, as I said, we saw the city of Brampton move ahead, working with this government in exchange, rather, for a $114 million investment. They're going to get more homes built, Mr. Speaker. They're dealing with missing middle housing. They're dealing with exclusionary zoning. I thank the city of Brampton.
Député de Kenora.
Mr. Speaker, a recent survey has found nearly 70% of millennials and those younger have put off the purchase of a home because of rising prices and rising interest rates. After 8 years of this NDP Liberal government, that is their legacy. Inflationary deficits that are driving up the cost of living and making housing out of reach for many young people across the country. It's clear this Prime Minister is not worth the cost, so why doesn't he finally listen to our common sense approach to stop his inflationary spending so that Canadians can afford a home again?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Talks about young people, and I'll give him credit in his time during being a member of Parliament. He has put issues on the table with respect to youth, so he can support this government, or at least he should have, with respect to the tax-free savings account that this government put in place to help young people save for a down payment. Up to $40,000 can be put into that account. Again, tax-free. Add to that, of course, the fact that we continue to build more. We continue to put in place, rather, policies that will see more homes built. We're doing that in partnership with municipalities. They're against all of that, Mr. Speaker. They've put half measures on the table. That's not good enough.
Shame. Député de Kenora.
Mr. Speaker, Canadians don't have the funds to put into a savings account because of the cost of living crisis this government has created. He mentions building homes. Mr. Speaker, we have not enough home building in this country to keep up with demand. After 8 years of this government, housing prices have skyrocketed. They've actually doubled. Mortgage rates are up, and the young students and young professionals have given up completely on their dream of home ownership. So I ask again, when will they finally stop their inflationary spending so that young people can afford a home?
Mr. Speaker, when the Conservatives were in power, they ran 7 consecutive deficits. I find it interesting that they claim to be so concerned about a 0.7% deficit that we have here in Canada, the lowest of all G7 countries, Mr. Speaker. We have a serious plan in order to build more homes in this country. We have a serious piece of legislation before this House that the Conservatives are delaying. This will solve the housing crisis, and the Conservatives are delaying that measure, Mr. Speaker.
Terrible. Then I have Deputy. I'm going to ask all colleagues, please, to continue, if you have conversations, to continue them outside of the House. It is now ceding the floor to the member from Kelowna Lake Country.
Mr. Speaker, Bloomberg just reported on a recent survey that shows how much Canadians are struggling after 8 years of this NDP Liberal government's inflationary spending. 65% of Canadians now say they're concerned about saving for retirement, and 63% are concerned about how to prepare for an unexpected financial event. Less savings, more concern, more risk. This Prime Minister is just not worth the cost. When will the Prime Minister end his inflationary spending so Canadians can plan for their future again?
Then I have Secrétaire parlementaire.
I find it curious that the member opposite even refers to pensions, Mr. Speaker. Under what the Conservatives are proposing, they would gut Canada Pension Plan, Mr. Speaker. What the Conservatives are proposing would also result in Canadian families receiving less money from the federal government. You see, we have the Canada Child Benefit. In fact, checks are going out today, Mr. Speaker, to families right across the country. That is important support for families that are having a hard time to make ends meet, and the Conservatives would see that program completely cut.
Exactly. Then I have Deputy de Kelowna Lake Country.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. And speak about misinformation and how that response has nothing to do with what's actually happening in people's lives. The latest MNP Consumer Debt Index shows 51% of Canadians are $200 or less away from not being able to complete their financial obligations. Quote, facing a combination of rising debt carrying costs, living expenses, and concern over the potential for continued interest rate and price hikes, many Canadians are stretched uncomfortably close to broke. This is Canada after 8 years of this NDP Liberal government. When will the Prime Minister stop his inflationary spending so Canadians can afford to live again?
L'honorable secrétaire parlementaire.
Mr. Speaker, the member opposite claims that there is misinformation. I would welcome her to clarify where exactly. You see, the Conservatives have consistently said that they do not want to support Canadians with the programs that we have in place. We have the Canada Child Benefit Program, Mr. Speaker, that is supporting families, that is helping making ends meet. Perhaps she would like to clarify, is that where they are going to cut? Are they going to cut our programs for seniors, Mr. Speaker? Seniors are relying on our government at this time. Mr. Speaker, what the Conservatives are proposing is simply reckless. At a time like this, we need responsible government.
Too much risk. Too much risk.
The Honourable Member for Drummond. Mr. Speaker, let's talk about Amira El Gawabi, the Prime Minister's advisor against Islamophobia. Many noted her long silence on the war between Israel and Hamas. Then everyone noticed when she broke her silence after 10 days, not a word on the attacks perpetuated by Hamas, not a word on the massacres, kidnappings, rapes. We hoped for some sort of condemnation, but there was not even a mention of it. Her role is to build bridges between communities. Does the government consider that she has been building bridges this week? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary. Our government has been clear. The attacks by Hamas against Israel were terrorist attacks. Ms. El Gawabi has a mandate to fight Islamophobia. That is a 100% national mandate. We are working with our new special envoy against anti-Semitism to fight discrimination towards Muslims here and is supporting other communities as well. The Honourable Member for Drummond.
Des députés musulmans et juifs du gouvernement se sont réunis malgré leurs désaccords pour réitérer conjointement l'importance que tous les citoyens se sentent en sécurité au Canada, peu importe leur religion. Ça, c'est faire œuvre utile, Monsieur le Président, et je salue.
Je regrette d'interrompre.
Oh, I regret to interrupt the Honourable Member, but apparently we had a translation problem. Is everything resolved now? We will ask the member for Drummond to restart from the top, please.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yesterday, Muslim and Jewish MPs met in spite of their disagreements to reiterate how important it is for all citizens to feel safe in Canada regardless of their religion. And that's useful. Ms. El Gawabi is unable to recognize even the existence of the attacks by Hamas and the anger, fear, and suffering that they caused, including among her own citizens. Does the government think that she missed an opportunity to be useful?
Ministre.
The Honourable Minister. Mr. Speaker, like my honourable colleague, I share the feeling that it is important to protect all Canadians. Everybody is feeling worried about their safety, the safety of their communities, the places where they get together for fully justifiable reasons. I had discussions with ministers from various provinces and territories, and we discussed ways we can reassure and protect Canadians. We're making use of our intelligence services as well, and we're going to mobilize everything. The Honourable Member for Edmonton, Wetaskiwin. Sorry for mispronouncing the title.
Who grew up in the 70s and 80s remember a disastrous Trudeau economic legacy that most definitely was not worth the cost. 14 deficits in 15 years leading to an inflation crisis, an energy crisis, and a housing crisis. The long-term impact of interest payments on that Trudeau debt forced another Liberal government a decade later to cut a devastating 32% from transfers for healthcare, education, and social services. This Liberal NDP government is going down the exact same road. How much will they spend on interest on their record debt this year?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
We constantly talk about the record of fiscal responsibility, Mr. Speaker. During the Stephen Harper years, they ran 7 consecutive deficits.
Wow.
Deficits, Mr. Speaker. Under this government, we've seen economic growth. We've seen this government go through an extremely challenging time in the pandemic. But guess what? Businesses are still there. They are finding ways to thrive as a result of the ways that we supported them and continue to find ways to support them. When Canadians need support for key other challenges now, like housing, we are there. They're putting half measures on the table. They're not worth the risk, Mr. Speaker.
Hear, hear. Député d'Edmonton-Wetaskiwin.
Well, Mr. Speaker, after 8 years of mind-blowing, unprecedented, previously unfathomable increases in spending, this government's response to every question is to ask why we won't help them spend even more. Again and again and again, we on this side will stand up against an incompetent Liberal government that is leading us down a path of economic devastation. Again, my question was reasonable and straightforward, and I'd appreciate an answer this time. What will this Liberal NDP government spend on interest on its record debt this year?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
It is a surplus. They turn it into deficit after deficit after deficit, Mr. Speaker. On this side, we put constructive measures on the table, like lifting GST on the building of rentals for Canadians. They talk about an attachment that they have to a vision for the country that puts the middle class front and center. It's not true, Mr. Speaker. Why are they proposing at this time, at a time where Canadians are facing a housing crisis, to tax the building of rentals for the middle class? It makes no sense. A reckless approach from start to finish.
Député de Selkirk-Interlake Eastman.
After 8 miserable years, our military heroes can no longer afford this Prime Minister. This NDP Liberal government keeps driving troop morale down and their costs up. A recently leaked report stated, increasingly members will release from the Canadian Forces rather than relocate to an area they cannot afford or taking a loss on an existing home. The Canadian Armed Forces are in a crisis and are short 16,000 people, but these Liberals are pushing people away and making things worse. Why is the Prime Minister destroying our military?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary. Mr. Speaker, before I start, I just want to recognize that today we remember Adjunct Patrice Vincent, who lost his life in 2014.
Of the honourable member, I would like to say that, when you think about the housing situation, just last year in our fiscal update, we put $55 million towards the support in residential housing for our CAF member. Also, I would like to acknowledge the support that we're putting on our member when they relocate of the reimbursement, legal and real estate fee. Mr. Speaker, we will always be there for our military.
Député de Selkirk-Interlake Eastman.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister is actually repeating Liberal history known as the Decade of Darkness. Soldiers and their families back then were forced to use food banks. There were slashes to training programs. They operated on old equipment and were sent to Afghanistan without proper boots or uniforms. And now this month the headlines read, soldiers asking for donations to help with housing and food costs. Canadian Forces personnel leaving the ranks over lack of affordable housing. Canada looking to cut $1 billion from the national defence budget. Our troops are out there fighting for our freedoms. Why is this Prime Minister attacking their economic freedom?
Before I continue, I'd like to encourage members, especially those who are at the far end of the House, to please not have conversations as it can cause disruption in the House. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And again, I want to say thanks to the member for his questions because it actually allows me just to validate some of the measures and the supports that we have put in place for our military. As I mentioned earlier, the reimbursing, the legal and the real estate fees, the covering of some expense for dual residency for up to 6 months if a CAM member cannot sell their residence. We will continue also supporting our Canadian Armed Force posted across the country and their family. For example, the post-living differential allowance is intended to help reduce financial burdens for CAF personnel and their family. Mr. Speaker, we will not take any lessons from this side of the House.
The Honourable Member from Edmonton Strathcona.
Mr. Speaker, Canada has supported international justice efforts in response to the wars in Ukraine and Syria, but has refused to support international court investigations in Israel and Palestine. The parties in this conflict and the victims of this conflict need to know that violations of international law will be prosecuted. This includes terror attacks and collective punishment. International law applies to everyone. There are no exceptions. Why won't Canada support independent court investigations into violations of international law by all parties to the war in Israel and Palestine?
L'honorable secrétaire parlementaire.
Right now, the alleviating of human suffering is our #1 priority. We continue and we will continue to push that all parties respect humanitarian and international law. This means access for civilians. This means accountability for those who do not follow international law. And this means that we are using every diplomatic channel that we have to alleviate the suffering and to ensure that aid gets to the Palestinian civilians and that international law is complied with. Thank you.
L'honorable député de London Fanshawe.
The war between Hamas and Israel keeps taking the lives of so many innocent Israelis and Palestinians. The humanitarian crisis in Gaza is getting worse by the minute. People in Gaza have very little access to water, food, or electricity. They're forced to flee their homes or be bombed, and half of them are children. Palestinians and Israelis deserve to live in peace, and that's why the NDP has been calling for an immediate ceasefire and the release of the hostages. Why won't this government do everything in their power to save lives by calling for a ceasefire?
L'honorable secrétaire parlementaire.
Mr. Speaker, Canada will continue to support Palestinian civilians in Gaza facing urgent humanitarian needs. Our initial commitment of $10 million in humanitarian assistance to trusted partners in Gaza will provide food, water, emergency medical assistance, and protection services. We were the first Western country to do so, and others have now started following suit. We will continue to be there. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
L'honorable député de Cloverdale, Langley City.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, national parks protect Canada's iconic terrestrial and aquatic environments while providing opportunities for public understanding, education, and enjoyment for these protected areas. Having worked for Parks Canada for more than 30 years prior to politics, I can appreciate the importance of protecting and preserving the beautiful landscapes that represent the very best of Canada. Can the Parliamentary Secretary share with this House the progress that our government is making to protect and conserve these national wonders for future generations? Thank you.
L'honorable secrétaire parlementaire.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank the honourable member for his advocacy and for Parks Canada all these years. Absolutely. Yesterday, our government introduced Bill S14, Protecting Canada's Natural Wonders Act. This bill ensures that along with its partners, Parks Canada has the authorities and tools to protect these lands for current and future generations. This represents an increase of more than 12 million hectares protected under legislation, a landmass slightly smaller than the combined area of New Brunswick and Nova Scotia. I hope that all parliamentarians can work together to ensure the passage of this important piece of legislation. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
L'honorable député de Yellowhead.
Mr. Speaker, after 8 long years under the Prime Minister, Canadians expect more than just empty promises on housing. Construction is down and costs are climbing up and way up. And this NDP Liberal coalition's inflationary spending feels like a cruel joke to those trying to afford affordable home. This Prime Minister is just not worth the cost. Mr. Speaker, isn't it time for some common sense conservative solutions to ensure every Canadian has a roof over their head?
L'honorable secrétaire parlementaire.
Mr. Speaker, as you well know, there is a bill on this table, on this floor rather, that the Conservatives can get behind. The result, if they decided to support it, would be a more affordable situation for builders because it lifts GST off the construction of rental apartments. They're not in favor of that, Mr. Speaker. They want to tax the construction of rental apartments for the middle class. On top of that, we are putting forward measures to help support builders by making sure there's training programs available so laborers can be available. They've got no support for that, Mr. Speaker. Entirely reckless approach that they take.
The Honourable Député d'Oxford.
Mr. Speaker, after 8 long years of this Liberal NDP government, 7 million Canadians are now struggling to put food on their tables thanks to their carbon tax. When you tax the farmer who grows the food and you tax the trucker who ships the food, you ultimately punish the Canadian who buys the food. And now we have Canadians driving across the U.S. border to buy basic grocery essentials. This Prime Minister is not worth the cost. Hear, hear. Will this Prime Minister do the honourable thing, axe the carbon tax, and bring home affordable groceries for all Canadians?
L'honorable secrétaire parlementaire.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Conservatives consistently use the carbon price as a scapegoat for global inflation in this House. I think they're having trouble grasping the concept of magnitude. Mr. Speaker, the Bank of Canada governor recently said carbon pricing contributed 0.15% to inflation. That's equivalent to 15 cents on a $100 grocery bill. While the European Central Bank said climate change contributes as much as 3% to the cost of food per year, that's $3 on a $100 grocery bill. That means that climate change has 20 times the influence on food prices than the carbon price. So if Conservatives were serious about fighting global inflation, they'd have a plan to fight climate change.
L'honorable député de Bellechasse-les-Etchemins.
The honourable member for Bellechasse-les-Etchemins-Lévis. Mr. Speaker, inflation is hitting Quebec harder than any other province. Groceries up 23%. That's what Quebecers are dealing with. The food banks are swamped with people who can't afford to go to the grocery store. All this against a backdrop of indifference from the government and the complicity of the Bloc, who want to see radical tax hikes. A vote for the Bloc will cost you dearly. Will the Prime Minister show some empathy, do the right thing, and cancel his costly carbon tax?
The
Honourable Minister. Good morning, Mr. Speaker, and I thank my colleague for raising this question on behalf of her riding in Quebec. She doesn't know that perhaps doesn't know that her colleagues in the Conservative Party voted against our assistance to children in 2016 with the Canada Child Benefit. And thanks to that, every month families get a tax-free check that has raised 40% of kids out of poverty. Is she against the Canada Child Benefit? The honourable member for Chicoutimi-Le-Fjord. Mr. Speaker, after 8 years of this government, the Liberals are making Quebecers poorer. Based on statistics from Stats Can, the cost of living is going up faster than Quebecers' wages. And milk has gone up 17 cents a litre. The Bloc claims to defend Quebecers, but they want to raise taxes radically, even more than the Liberals have. A vote for the Bloc will cost you dearly. When will the Liberals get rid of the carbon tax to help Quebecers keep their heads above water? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary. Mr. Speaker, once again, when I speak to Quebecers, they tell me it's going to cost way too much to vote for the Conservatives. The Conservatives will bring in austerity. They will cut in support to seniors and families with kids. They will make cuts to the assistance Canadians need in order to make ends meet. Mr. Speaker, we are there to support them. The Conservatives, it's not worth the risk.
The
honourable member for Saint-Hyacinthe-Bagotte. Mr. Speaker, Amnesty International is calling on EDC to stop financing Canadian mining companies in Colombia, where there are more and more human rights violations. 146 political dissidents were killed last year. 46% of all the political assassinations in the world. Environmental activists, farmers, Indigenous peoples, and anyone who questions what mining companies are doing, they're all in danger. Will put an end to financing or funding for mining companies in Colombia where there are serious concerns that they're contributing to a climate of human rights violations. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Human rights. This is why we created the core, to maintain social responsibility of businesses around the world. This is why we will continue always to ensure that when Canadians are doing business, when others are doing business around the world, particularly mining companies, we will always stand up for human rights everywhere, all the time. Thank you.
Good job.
The Honourable Member for Saint-Hyacinthe-Bagotte. Obviously, the Corps can't even call witnesses. I went to Colombia in 2021 on a human rights observation mission, and I can tell you we heard some disturbing accounts. Ottawa has no idea what the mining companies are doing abroad. EDC has no credible mechanism for monitoring and tracking. Ottawa needs better accountability and transparency from the companies it funds in countries where human rights are violated. Will they listen to Amnesty International and limit the investments EDC is making in Canadian mining companies operating in Colombia? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
We have very strong export control mechanisms. We always stand up for human rights. The Canadian Ombudsperson for Responsible Enterprise specifically was created so that we can work together with businesses. We know that there are ways in which that can be strengthened. This is exactly why we are listening, why when the International Subcommittee on International Human Rights did a study, the government accepted those recommendations regarding CORE, and we will work together with everyone in this House to ensure that Canada and Canadians, when we are abroad, stand for human rights. Thank you.
Good job. L'honorable député de Leeds, Grenville, Thousand Islands, Rideau Lakes.
After 8 years of this government and this NDP Liberal Prime Minister, it's no surprise that their billion-dollar green slush fund is lining the pockets of Liberal insiders and is now under investigation. Annette Verschaeren is a good friend of the Prime Minister and chair of the board that's doling out this taxpayer cash. But it turns out her own company received millions from that same fund. This Prime Minister simply isn't worth the cost. So how many other Liberal insiders got rich with this green slush fund?
Mr. Speaker, I know the Canadians are wising up to the fact that the Conservatives are just not worth the risk. But let me answer the member's question by saying, when the minister became aware of the alleged or the allegations of mismanagement at SDTC, he immediately acted and commissioned a review. The review resulted in an action plan that the executive is now implementing by December. And we expect the highest standards of excellence and governance from all of our federal agencies, Mr. Speaker. Thank you.
L'honorable député de Leeds, Grenville, Thousand Islands, Rideau Lakes.
This is the same scandal that has whistleblowers pleading for legal and career protection after exposing this latest scandal in this billion-dollar boondoggle. We know everyone from the board chair to the CEO are in a conflict of interest. They all protect each other and they all make money, and it's all on the backs of Canadians. This Prime Minister simply isn't worth the cost. So will the Prime Minister guarantee these whistleblowers the same protection afforded to whistleblowers in Canada's public service?
L'honorable secrétaire parlementaire.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As I said earlier, when the minister became aware of the allegations of mismanagement in this particular case, he immediately acted to commission a third-party independent review of SDTC. That review produced an action plan that now SDTC is implementing by December. That will make a substantive difference to resulting or addressing the mismanagement. The highest standards of governance are the expectations that Canadians should have, and it's exactly what our government is doing.
L'honorable député de Lac-Saint-Louis.
The honourable member for Lac-Saint-Louis.
Je m'excuse.
I'm sorry. I apologize to the honourable member for Leeds, Grenville, Thousand Islands and Rideau Lake. Apparently you have a third question. I thought you only had two today.
What Canadians expect is that whistleblowers, when they bring to light corruption with this Liberal government, that they will be afforded protection. But we've seen before how this government treats the rule of law. This is a Prime Minister who blocked the RCMP from pursuing a criminal investigation into Liberal corruption by hiding documents from them. If anyone else hid documents from the RCMP, they'd end up in handcuffs. But with these Liberals, what we see is the continuation of that cover-up. After 8 years, it's a Prime Minister who isn't worth the cost to our democratic institutions. So what evidence is this Prime Minister so desperate to hide from the RCMP, and why does he think that he's above the law?
L'honorable secrétaire parlementaire.
It's no surprise that what the member falsely claims here is something that we take issue with. Earlier this year, when the minister became aware of the allegations of mismanagement, he acted immediately and decided to conduct a fact-finding exercise through an impartial third-party review. That third party produced a report, and that report has now resulted in an action plan that's being implemented. That's going to make a substantial difference in addressing the issues that have been identified. Let's make one thing clear. We expect the highest standards of governance from all federal agencies, and that's exactly what we're standing up for.
The honourable member for Lac Saint Louis. Mr. Speaker, the well-being of veterans and their families will always be a priority for our government. But we also know that Canadians across the country want to help our veterans too. Whether it's through organizations that provide housing, mental health services, or assistance with the adjustment to civilian life, Canadians and other veterans themselves are mobilizing to support our heroes. Can the Minister of Veteran Affairs tell the House how our government is helping those who support our veterans?
The
Honourable Minister. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to thank my honourable colleague for his question. He's absolutely right. Canadians and other veterans are mobilizing to help those who have served our country. Since we launched the Veterans and Family Wellbeing Fund, we've been able to invest in innovative projects like the Veteran Homelessness Project in Fredericton and the Legion Veterans Village in Surrey. Whether supporting women, veterans, families, mental health, or employment and rehabilitation initiatives, this fund helps veterans from coast to coast. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Calgary Centre.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the Supreme Court has affirmed every argument regarding the overreach of this government's disastrous Impact Assessment Act. Its effects have been over $100 billion of projects cancelled. No major projects have proceeded. 42 projects are in limbo. First Nations can't get roads built to their communities. This bull-headed ideology has broken Canada's regulatory system. After 8 years, will this NDP Liberal government finally take a lesson, abide by the Constitution, and stay in their lane?
Secrétaire parlementaire.
Mr. Speaker, after a decade of the Harper government, they gutted environmental regulation and still got nothing built. Our government is continuing to review the ruling, and we'll have more information to share soon about aligning existing legislation with the Supreme Court's ruling. We have previously said the current system will remain in place. We will have more to share soon, including any changes or guidance on the project. Fortunately, Mr. Speaker, the Conservatives have zero credibility on the environment. They're just not worth the risk.
Once again, before we continue with questions, I'll ask members please to limit their comments to the people who have the floor. Honourable member from Calgary Centre.
Well, I advise the member across the way that the last project was built in 2016 was under the previous government's environmental assessment regime, LNG Canada. But the Chief Justice is clear in his statements. He says very clearly the federal government cannot overstep its boundaries into provincial jurisdiction. Who else has said this bill was an immense overreach? Every province, over 100 First Nations, industry groups across the country, this Conservative Party, and anyone who can read the Constitution. Will this NDP Liberal government finally accept this decision, respect provinces, and stay in their lane?
L'honorable secrétaire parlementaire.
Mr. Speaker, as stated earlier, when the Conservatives were in office, they gutted the environmental protection, eroded public trust, discouraged investment, and made it harder, not easier, to build projects. This was why we delivered better rules for environmental assessments to help move projects forward. While we were making amendments to the Act, the Supreme Court was clear. This Parliament can enact legislation to protect the environment. The Conservative Party's plan to eliminate the environmental protections and disregard Indigenous rights is reckless, unacceptable. That leader of the opposition is not worth the risk.
L'honorable député de Regina-Wascana.
Mr. Speaker, this week the Netherlands agreed to buy liquefied natural gas from the Middle Eastern dictatorship of Qatar for the next 27 years. Last week, France agreed to buy LNG from Qatar for the same amount of time. This is in addition to similar LNG deals that Germany recently signed with Middle Eastern dictatorships. Mr. Speaker, after 8 years, does this Liberal NDP government still believe there is no business case for Canadian LNG exports?
L'honorable secrétaire parlementaire.
Mr. Speaker, it's really shameful that the Conservative Party would use this humanitarian situation to peddle conspiracy theories. We need to work with our allies and delivering clean energy that they're asking for, whatever it's hydrogen or reactors. If the member of the opposition actually cares about supporting Canadian energy and allies, they would not have voted against Bill C-49, which has created good jobs, improved global security, and helped our allies.
Absolutely. L'honorable député de Fleetwood-Port Kells.
Mr. Speaker, we know that some Canadians are really struggling with the cost of living, and I recognize the outstanding support of our Muslim Food Bank, the Surrey Food Bank, the Gurdwara Duke Nirvan Sahib and Fleetwood-Port Kells, all stepping up to provide relief in Surrey and the south of Fraser. Their efforts complement steps our government's also taken to help with the community and help them cope. To those looking to us for help through these tough times, can the Minister of Families, Children and Social Development tell us what Canadians should expect next?
L'honorable ministre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the member. I have great news. Today, 3.5 million Canadians and over 6 million children will receive the Canada Child Benefit. I know raising children is expensive, especially now when the cost of necessities is high. Since 2016, this benefit has lifted hundreds of thousands of children out of poverty. This is just one more way that our government is supporting Canadian families.
L'honorable député de Courtenay-Alberni.
Mr. Speaker, for 2 years, the Liberal government has let a shipbreaking company in Union Bay break rules in sensitive fish habitats. This could put this important ecosystem and 50% of the BC shellfish industry at risk, threatening up to 500 jobs in the local economy. Local First Nations governments and residents are asking the Liberals to stop extending the permit for the Miller Freeman to be allowed to sit above the high tide zone. Will the government stop allowing this dangerous activity and further develop shipbreaking regulations to protect coastal communities?
Yes.
L'honorable secrétaire parlementaire.
Mr. Speaker, the Canadian Coast Guard is aware of an incident involving abandoned vessels in Union Bay, British Columbia. The Coast Guard is working with the Government of BC, and it's ready to assist with the situation as required. Furthermore, Mr. Speaker, the Canadian Coast Guard has reminded the parties involved of their obligations under the Canada Shipping Act. We will continue to monitor the situation, Mr. Speaker, and will be ready to assist local officials if required.
Hear, hear.
L'honorable député de Spadina-Fort York.
Mr. Speaker, this Liberal government suffers from amnesia. It forgot its election promise to Toronto to help the city with its deficit, and it's forgotten the 1951 UN Convention to the Status of Refugees, of which Canada is a signatory with obligations to support refugees we accept. Under the Resettlement Assistance Program, the government's supposed to help refugees get essential services and support for basic needs. Mr. Speaker, given last summer's debacle as refugees and asylum seekers slept on the streets, can the minister confirm the government will provide Toronto financial support to avoid a repeat, or does the government want to see refugees sleep in the snow?
Honorable secrétaire parlementaire.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As the number of refugees worldwide grows, Canada continues to protect the world's most vulnerable and be a leader in refugee resettlement. In 2020, Canada resettled 1/3 of all refugees around the world. In addition, between January and July of 2023, Canada has resettled 27,400 refugees, over half of our 2023 target of 51,300. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
This brings to the end of oral questions.